I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Chairman, there's a letter that was signed by more than 500 legal scholars across the ideological spectrum that I'd like to just read from very briefly. Speaking of the President's conduct, they say, the President's conduct is precisely the type of threat to our democracy that the founders feared when they included the remedy of impeachment in the Constitution. We take no position on whether the President committed a crime, but conduct need not be criminal to be impeachable. The standard here is constitutional. It does not depend on what Congress has chosen to criminalize. They go on to say impeachment is an especially essential remedy for conduct that corrupts elections. I know that my time is about to expire, so I'll come back to this before I introduce it, because I'd like to read some additional parts of it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself on the amendment, and I yield to Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like just to continue to read, because this, again, is a letter signed by more than 500 constitutional scholars. And I think some of the confusion my colleagues have been struggling with is the difference between impeachable offenses and violations of the criminal statute. So I hope this will help clarify that. They write, impeachment is a remedy for grave abuses of the public trust. Impeachment is an especially essential remedy for conduct that corrupts elections. The primary check on a president is political. If a president behaves poorly, voters can punish him or her at the polls. A president who corrupts the system of elections seeks to place himself beyond the reach of this political check. As the Constitutional Convention, George Mason described impeachable offenses as attempts to subvert the Constitution. Corrupting elections subverts the process by which the Constitution makes the president democratically accountable. Put simply, if a president cheats in his effort at re-election, trusting the democratic process to serve as a check through that election is no remedy at all. This is what an impeachment is for. They go on to say in this letter, whether President Trump's conduct is classified as bribery, as a high crime or misdemeanor, or both, it is clearly impeachable under our Constitution. So in asking that unanimous consent that this letter and more than 500 legal scholars signed to be made part of the record, I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will understand the basis of this article of impeachment, that the President of the United States violated the public trust, undermined the national security of the United States, betrayed our national interests by using the enormous power of his office, not to advance the public good, not to advance the policies of the United States and the interests of the United States, but to advance his own personal political benefit. That is exactly what the framers spoke about. That's not my conclusion alone. It was the conclusion of the scholars we heard from in our hearing and more than 500 legal scholars that have joined them. And so I hope we'll put to rest this notion that you have to violate a criminal statute. You know, a president could deface a post office, a mailbox. That's a federal crime. No one would suggest the president could be impeached for that. So the framers are talking about the abuses of the public trust, a violation of the most sacred oaths to honor the interests of the American people and not advance your own personal political interests. These constitutional scholars say it much better than I can, and as well as Professor Raskin has said, so I ask unanimous consent to be made part of the record.
Without objection. Reclaiming my time, I would simply point out a few things. Number one, that the impeachment of President Nixon, although he had committed many crimes, he was impeached. The committee voted impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of justice. It did not specify a specific crime. I would also point out that the majority staff report of the Judiciary Committee back in 1974, not just now, and I believe in 1998, but certainly 1974, pointed out that crimes and impeachable offenses are different things. There are crimes which may not be impeachable. There are impeachable offenses which may not be crimes. An impeachable offense, a high crime and misdemeanor, is a grave and serious offense against the Constitution, against the structure and function of government. I would refer you to the Federalist Papers. I would also say one other thing. We've repeatedly heard that the Democrats are accusing President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak of lying because President Zelensky said he wasn't pressured. Well, of course he said he wasn't pressured. The United States is a powerful nation on which his nation is dependent. He has a gun to his head. The gun is the fact that the President of the United States, upon whom he depends for military aid, for help in many different ways, has shown himself willing to withhold that aid and to do other things based on what he says, based on what he's willing to play along with the president for his personal political goals. So, of course, he denies he was pressured, because he knows that if he didn't deny that, there might be heavy consequences to pay, and you cannot credit that denial. And you cannot credit that denial without any aspersions on his character, but simply on the fact that the President of the United States holds a gun to his head. I yield back, and the question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call. Roll call.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? No. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? No. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Richmond? Mr. Jeffries? No. Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr.